Hi, everybody. Welcome to our next meeting of ARWG. The Secretary sends his regards. He is obviously dealing with legislative session and budget stuff, so he's not able to make it. I am Natalie Snyder. For those that I haven't met, I've been at DNR now about 3 months, and I am the director of the Chesapeake and Coastal Services Unit. And I am just really happy to be a part of this group and support the work here. So I'm going to turn it over to Rylan to do the roll call.
Yes, and as a reminder, the meeting is always being recorded for note taking, and since those are posted online, we no longer have to do the full meeting notes, but we are keeping just a high level important notes document for you to review. So to get kicked off with the roll call, Delegate Stein, Eric Myers, Bob Allen.
Here.
Gotcha. Thanks, Bob. Terrence Udall.
Hi, sorry, present.
Thanks. Gotcha, Terrence. Brandy Espinola.
Brandy's unable to be here. My name is Kristen. I'm with the Environmental Finance Center, sitting in on her behalf.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Matt Rowe.
This is Jim George sitting in for Matt.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And here's some strangs in the room. Vanessa Caliban.
I'm here.
Thanks, Vanessa. Tom Parham. Oh, there he is right there. Thank you. Cliff Mitchell. Debbie Hare Cornwell.
Here.
Thank you, Debbie. And I see Cliff just joined.
Afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, Cliff. Nadia Chahab.
I'm here.
Thank you, Nadia. Allison Gost in the room. Catherine McCall.
Hi, afternoon.
Thank you, Catherine. John Papavassilou. Bill Fawcett. Or Joy Patrick.
I'm here.
Thank you, Joy. All right, we do have enough for a quorum.
All right. So as Rylan mentioned, we are recording these as part of our meeting record, but we do have high level notes. So folks had a chance to review those or have any suggestions or edits at this moment. All right. So could I get a call to approve the meeting notes? So moved. And seconded. Second. And any opposed? All right, great. All right, first up on our agenda is a resilience metrics presentation. We talked about, what's that?
The site visit form. We just wanted to make a call out to everybody to remember to send me ideas. We're hoping to do a site visit / field trip at some point in the spring or early summer. I'd like to make sure these ideas are really suggestive of the diversity of input we have here in the group. So please fill out the form or send me an email and we can talk.
All right, resilience metrics presentation, something super important to ensure that we are not only planning for resilience, but monitoring our successes and learning from any failures. And so I'm really happy to introduce our speakers today. Kate Boyacourt has a lot of history with this group. And then Anushi Garg, who I both have a good history with because they are part of my former team at Environmental Defense Fund. And so they've done a lot of amazing work in New York and New Jersey on this. Anushi is the senior analyst for the Resilient Coasts and Watersheds team. And she collaborates with a diverse team of economists, scientists, policy experts, community members, and local partners to develop these equitable solutions and build lasting resilience in these communities. And then Kate Boyacourt is the director of EDF's Climate Resilient Coastal Watersheds team in the New York, New Jersey region. And she works with the team to foster partnerships that collectively advocate for these comprehensive, evidence-based and equitable policies and investments to build in that region and beyond. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Kate and Anishi for them to present.
Well, thank you so much. I knew she's going to drive here because she's going to give most of the presentation, but I'll just say first a few words. So Anushi, I don't know if you're able to share that. I have it pinned on the larger group, so maybe I should take that off so I can see it. But first want to say I'm a huge fan of Natalie and of Maryland. I used to work with Natalie. She was our boss here at the Climate Resilient Coastal Watersheds team, and so those of you that work with her now, you're lucky. Our loss is your gain. And also, I'm born and raised on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which is a unique place, as some of you all might know. Certainly spent a lot of time in Annapolis and Baltimore, but happy to talk about Maryland sometime. I worked a little bit on the adaptation plan back in 2010 or 2011, whenever we came out with that. And though I work in New York City a lot now, I am a Marylander through and through. So really thrilled to be joining you all today. So first, and I think it's not quite in presentation mode yet there, Anishi, I'm seeing the, I don't know if y'all can see that, but can see all the slides, but anyway, but yeah, so why did we sort of come here? I think well, let's talk a little bit of background. I think we'll talk a little bit about why we focus on measuring resilience, which I think might be probably pretty proximal to y'all, and you all get that. Let's go to the next slide. And then we'll talk a little bit about a project we did in New York City, sort of pilot getting to community informed and evidence-based metrics for resilience. And then we'll talk a little bit about applications and what we might be looking at next. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. I think a lot of the times we sort of ask the question, how resilient are we? We're not really great at answering that as a field. We're really great at understanding how bad things are through measures of social vulnerability and climate vulnerability. And on the left, I should highlight, this is the Climate Vulnerability Index that EDF and partners work to develop. It's really fantastic for looking at a whole range of indicators of vulnerability across the US. And then there's also the SOVI, Social Vulnerability Index, and others. And then formerly the EJ Screen and other tools that probably are not available right now on federal websites. There's also been a lot of efforts by states to develop strategies and goals and actions that they can take to address resilience. And some of them do track actions. And we kind of looked at this in a bit of a literature review to kind of get our bearings before we undertook this project. And then, Maryland is actually, I think, the closest that I've seen to trying to get to a measurable report of adaptation. Still a lot of qualitative indicators, but I think you all are actually really sort of making some progress there and trying to measure how we're doing. Next slide. And then I think the thing that was a bit of an aha moment for us is, this is a little bit of a wonky diagram, but one of the things that we really wanted to try to communicate in this project is that we know we have vulnerability, right? So the vulnerabilities that individuals or perhaps systems have to climate hazards. And then we have the hazards themselves. We're really good at mapping those as well. So the flood zones, the sea level rise area, inundation areas, areas of extreme heat, all of those things we're really great at measuring and mapping. But, to get to how we're doing, and we really wanted to focus on mapping here because we think it's really helpful to spatially be able to map indicators and metrics, because then we can really get a sense of how well a particular area is doing compared to another. It's useful for advocacy, it's useful for managers to spot problems. And so we were really trying to aim for metrics that could tell us something about how healthy the systems are that really build up the base components of resilience. And then you can kind of map that and overlay that with vulnerability and hazard and see sort of how are we doing. Next slide. I think this is off to you, Anushi. So Anushi will take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. And thanks for being here, everyone. So Kate kind of gave us the context for this work, and I'm going to start with talking about some of the process that we followed and getting to the indicators that we came up with for New York City. And so how we kind of went about this work was that we started with doing a landscape analysis and reviewing some of the work that's been already done about this and plans that use the concept of indicators. So how they're defining resilience, what kind of indicators already exist, and then also how they're being used. So that was kind of one part of the process that we started with. Part two of the process was a very key part actually, which was engaging with stakeholders and advocates. And that's a picture of us having a workshop, one of the workshops. And the goal here was to kind of keep refining our work as we went and making sure that things made sense and the things were useful and articulated some of the goals and priorities that stakeholders had. And then part three was actually reviewing and analyzing different New York City community-based plans and how to understand how they are thinking about resilience and then using that to create indicators. And so this is a kind of a map or tool that we put together with the Regional Plan Association and Rebuild by Design. And it's a collection of 41 community-based plans around or spread out through New York City. Some of these were led by communities and some of them were led by the government. So it's a combination of 41 plans. And so through this mapper, we kind of extracted the main goals that these plans articulated, and we pulled together a total of 500 goals, which then we refined and processed as we went through creating these indicators. And so based on the 500 goals that we had, we kind of pared that down and we condensed it into 5 kind of core goal types and 30 subtypes as a way to consolidate some of the thinking that was going on there. And really the goal here was that there was a lot of overlapping language, and we wanted to make sure that we preserved the original idea and thought and main concepts behind what the focus areas were. Something I'd also mentioned here is that, like I said, some of these are government-based, government-led plans, and some of these are community-led. And so when we compared kind of the priorities there, we learned something interesting. We learned was that government-led plans tended to focus more on goals, and then plans, we found that a lot of they were balanced, but the social goals were one of the more frequent type of goal that we found. So that was just like, you know, as we went, this is just one of the learnings or observations that we had. And so based on all this work of consolidating 500 goals down to something that we could actually work with, we ended up with 8 final goal themes, which are these. And then these are the goals we use then to articulate our indicators. We also compared these to Maryland's focus areas and sectors that we were looking at as a way to see how this work kind of compares. And we found a lot of similarities and obviously some differences because each place has, right, like some things that's priority to them. So one of the things I would point out here is that we found a focus area for justice, equity, and diversity and inclusion in the Maryland focus areas. And while in our case, we don't have that as a goal theme separately, it's kind of integrated throughout the work and how we've articulated our indicators. And so social indicators are kind of mixed into the resilience indicators, and we've thought a lot about distributional equity and the kind of communities that are impacted. Another one is human health as one of the sectors in the Maryland plan, and similar to that is our goal theme under healthy communities, the third one, which gets to a similar similar goal. And then for economically and socially restorative, that section, which is goal number 2 in our work, is also similar to the climate and jobs training focus area. And then if you look at the protecting critical infrastructure, that's very much in line with the build infrastructure and shelter goals under our work, which is 5 and 6. So these are some common themes. The only difference we saw is in the natural resources. So we tended to focus less on that in New York City. There's also less data for that in New York City, and finding data sources is a big part of this work. And it seems like Meriden has a lot of extensive data sets and goals in the next gen plan that's more suitable for the state. So just pointing out some similarities and differences there, and how this work can be adapted in different contexts. So so far, this is kind of like the process we followed and how we went about this work. I'll move forward and talk about some of the indicators we found and how this work all came together. But before I get to that, just want to pause for a second, set us all on the same page. When we started this work, something we found was that there's a lot of floating terms, which can seem complicated to people working on this. So there's themes, there's goals, there's indicators, metrics. And so just to set a common stage, themes is the term we use for like the goal theme. So like restorative and socially and economically restorative or natural infrastructure, that would be a theme or basically a commonality between different indicators. A goal is the larger vision, right? That a government or any plan would have. An indicator is kind of like the specific variable to measure how a goal is being achieved. And the metric is a specific quantitative or qualitative data stream that can be used to measure that indicator. So for example, if we talk about green and natural infrastructure, then a goal would be that we want to maximize tree canopy. An indicator of that would be how much tree canopy exists. And then to measure how much tree canopy, the metric would be number of trees, let's say. So it kind of like follows that pattern. And then the last thing is targets. And to that, in this project, we didn't focus a lot on targets specifically, but target kind of refers to like a long-term commitment that a state or a municipality, let's say, has. So we want for New York City, that wasn't something that came up for us, but for example, let's say this work gets adapted in New Jersey, and they have a climate resilience plan, they have broader climate resilience commitments. And so something like that could be like a target for the state or for a city. So just wanted to talk through these terms with everyone. Okay, so now we've understood these concepts and understand how it works. These next slides are just examples of things we came up with. So one of the themes, like I was saying, was green and natural infrastructure. And for this one, the goal here was natural resources and habitats are healthy and maximized, and that we combat urban heat and flooding. And so like multiple benefits. And so one of the indicators, for instance, is absorbing stormwater, and tree canopy was another one that we came up with. And tree canopy has multiple benefits because it can provide cooling and absorb stormwater also. And so the metrics then kind of followed that, how much water can be absorbed, for example, and like how many air pollutants can be cleaned from the air. And then we also have proposed data sources. We tried to do this as much as possible to make these indicators and metrics like applicable and something that can be actually used and ideally also mapped at some stage. And we have details of all of this in the appendix in our report, for which I can drop the link after the presentation. And then we have another one, built infrastructure, which kind of gets to more critical infrastructure type of goals. And a lot of this one was about accessibility and making sure that residents can have access to a safe shelter in a time of emergency. And so this one kind of focused on that. And then this one was about kind of similar to the diversity equity goal that the state of Maryland had. And the focus here was to make sure that that we're addressing environmental justice and making sure that funding is flowing equitably and supporting the communities that are disadvantaged and need it most. So these are kind of examples of things. We have indicators for each of the 8 themes, and they kind of address these different things that came up. Okay, so switching to some of the applications of this work. When we started, we had some idea of how this work could be used. And then as we went, we kept refining the work, kept talking to communities and having engagement. And then we realized that the goal of how this work could be used has also evolved. And so by the time we ended, we realized that our first audience we had thought would be government managers, but then also advocates and community-based organizations can also use this work in their work. Government managers specifically, we're working with the state of New Jersey right now and trying to put together, trying to adapt this work for New Jersey, and hoping that we can get the opportunity to create a similar set of indicators for the state. So we're working with the Chief Resilience Officer and their office to work on that, and we're very excited about that actually. And then for advocates, of course, this can be used as a way to almost create like a report card of like how is the city doing. And then also community-based organizations can use collecting data along these data points and metrics to advocate for their work, also leverage funding, and to ensure that their community is supported as it needs. And I think this is the last slide. This is just to show an example of how these things come together. In the beginning, Kate mentioned that a lot of times indicators tend to be talked about in the context of vulnerability or exposure to floods. What we're saying here is that for resilience indicators and to be meaningful and for this work to be useful, it's meaningful to combine exposure, vulnerability, and resilience type of indicators together and overlap them, and especially mapping them to see like where the gaps are. So this map was inspired by the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, who have done this kind of work of assessing environmental justice. And so in this one, we've mapped social vulnerability index with the floodplain and toxic sites. And clearly the map shows which communities are more vulnerable and where are the gaps in service. And so the hope is that in the longer term, if work like this gets adopted, then these kind of visualizations can be created to actually see what's going on and then go from there and take action. So yeah, I'll stop there and looking forward to questions.
All right, thank you, Kate and Nishi. So I'll open it up to questions. You can raise your hand or put a question in the chat, and then I'll open it up to the room if anybody has a question or.
I have a question. So, in the applications for this, you mentioned measuring progress and triaging resources. I'm just curious if you've had those conversations with any government agencies or kind of work groups like this related to if there's any hesitancy to adopting that. So I'm at the Department of Transportation, and we've been trying to figure out what are those metrics, what are the measures, and kind of how that practically looks. And there's definitely some hesitancy just in trying to make sure that what we're measuring is reflecting what's happening and that it does inform kind of resilience decisions, that we're not measuring the wrong thing or kind of interpreting the metrics wrong. So I'm just wondering if you've had any of those conversations.
I think it's a hard thing no matter what when you get to a metric, because you're sort of committing to measuring a few things, right? And so I think there is value in sort of thinking about a bunch of different metrics and having an index that you could pull apart as a manager and really look and see what's going on. We've had this conversation, I'd say, with a sort of a couple of government folks. We've talked to New York City, we've talked to New Jersey, as Nishi has indicated, and they've expressed some interest in doing this because for that reason, but also for public communication. But actually, when we were first scoping out this project, a colleague of mine was working, maybe specifically for your purposes, with the Boston Tea. And they did a similar project, and we were comparing notes, actually, that contact, if it's helpful to you specifically for transportation, where they looked, they did interview, kind of like we interviewed stakeholders, in this case, community members and government plans. They interviewed the service providers, so that everybody involved in maintenance to operations, and also I think did some level of engagement of users of the system. And I don't know what their final metrics look like, but I know the consultant that kind of worked on that one, if you're interested specifically in transportation metrics.
Yeah, and I'll definitely follow up and thank you for that. And I think the level of kind of where do you measure when you have agency overall goals or statewide goals, but then you're trying to get down to more of the community level, it can kind of be a balance of what exactly you're measuring and what it means on a scaled up level. So I'll follow up, that'd be helpful for us.
Great. Cliff?
Anushi, it's nice to see you again.
You too.
Anushi and I worked together a couple of years ago. So
That's right.
it's a really interesting project, and sort of thinking back to some of the work that we did around the environmental public health tracking portal and thinking about health impact assessment, which this is not, and I noticed you very carefully did not use the words health impact assessment anywhere in the presentation. Nevertheless, this is sort of a piggyback on Allison's question, which is the criticism that we've heard over and over again about this whole approach is how much time it takes to process this information and make it useful in the time span that the decision maker has to decide whether, for example, to approve a permit or approve a project, et cetera. So did you guys specifically talk about what this looks like operationally, what the time span looks like, whether you have to fundamentally alter the permitting process to incorporate it, or whether there's a way to do it in a time frame that is practical?
I'm happy to take a crack at it, but Anushi, I don't know if the public health pieces maybe you can address, but in terms of the, we didn't think specifically about permitting. I think, to your question, Cliff, I think it depends on the application. And we were thinking a little bit more about a geospatial layer of existing data, ideally, that you can stack and update annually, which hopefully wouldn't take as much of a lift as tracking new data. Although there were some new data sources that we've identified as things that we'd really like to have. But I think, we didn't really get into permitting or review of projects. We've done some work on design guidelines related, or done some work on resilience design guidelines that have more of a project focus. But thinking a little, and also I should mention New York City is developing or has developed budgetary review processes, which there are pluses and minuses in that. And I think it has created a fair amount of work for that office, for the output. I don't want to speak too specifically about that because I just know some very basics about that process. So I think that particular application that we're thinking of is some sort of geospatial tool in which you can kind of see geographically how we're doing on our electric reliability index, or these different pieces that comprise some of these components. Anisha, do you have anything to add to that, or want to speak to any of Cliff's questions or health perspective? It's true, we didn't. I don't know enough about that.
Yeah, nothing specifically on the health perspective that comes to mind, but I think Yeah, I think we didn't, permitting specifically wasn't something that we were considering. I think it was more like working on putting together the indicators, first and foremost, that are relevant to the place, and then two, finding data sources that can accurately capture that indicator. And I think the third key piece of something like this, which always becomes important, is like that these kind of tools or metrics are created and then put aside. And I think in terms of timeline, something I always think about is that if this work has to stay relevant and useful, then something like a data source has to be kept updated, because things in government change all the time, and then links get broken, things get removed, scrubbing happens, and so all sorts of things happen. And so I think the longer term success for this work includes, keeping all the threads together, because there's a lot of loose threads, and it's not like one agency is necessarily keeping this alive. It's a collaborative effort, I think, for it to be successful.
And your question is making me think even more, Cliff. I think we were concerned less with measuring the impact of an action and more on the status as it is now, to be able to measure the actual state of things. How many heat deaths are there, which is, a health indicator, but it is very clear outcome of some sort, that's based on a few different actions. So trying to maybe help be an indicator of potential problems and successes, but not necessarily, a little more agnostic on impact. I don't know if we achieved that with every indicator, but that was sort of the aim.
No, I appreciate that from a surveillance point of view. So thank you for that. That's helpful.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Mizrahi. I'm one of the climate commissioners. Currently, our state is dealing with a state budget crisis. And of course, we have the federal impacts of the cuts for basically all climate and environmental work and regulations. Our commission in particular has a law that says we're supposed to track climate spending in our state. And in fact, on our website for the Climate Commission, there is a report about that. But our legislation did not stipulate how to count the financial costs of climate across the state. There is no guidance as how we are to track that. There are governments that have done that through climate budget tagging. And I'm curious as to whether your team was doing climate budget tagging, or if you have any advice about that, because it's very clear that as we're trying to deal with the state budget crisis, we have no way at this point for the state of Maryland to accurately either reflect on what we have spent, what we're currently spending, or what we might have to spend in the future.
Yeah, we haven't done that ourselves. I'd be happy to connect you to folks that have experience with that. As I mentioned, in New York City, I've heard, both positives and negatives about sort of where things are right now. I think it's a really strong intention. And then, thinking about how much time it takes to do the tracking of that, to perhaps Cliff's notes. I think like there are a few indicators that we highlight in here that are talking about damages to some extent, tracking damages to things. So I think there could be some way to sort of think about that. But if you're tagging to the budget and thinking about impact and potential reduction, I think that's a little different than our approach, but there are sort of some metrics out there, right? There's what is it, 13 now? The 13 to 1 savings on resilience. And even, I think, one of the simplest things that I feel like is helpful is if states and governments in general are tracking what spending they're doing on resilience at all. I think that's something that, from analyzing other government budgets, sometimes you have to kind of deduce it. And so when it comes to kind of assessing what you actually need and also sharing that with taxpayers and legislators, it's hard to put that together because it's often this weird mix of capital and program. And we don't always have it, it's a relatively new. I don't know how Maryland does it. But that was sort of a hodgepodge of answers to your question. Happy to connect you to people that have done that. I think the way that New York City, and I think they modeled it off of others, is not the only way to do it. And there might be simpler ways to do it that that get to the outcomes you're getting out of helping to sort of prioritize.
Thank you.
I have a question. This is Ryland. I can't tell if I'm off screen or not. But anyways, I wanted to ask how you kind of tackle the issue of wanting to show incremental progress while not getting bogged down in these really hyper-specific metrics that can sometimes crop up. Rather than having, you suggest large metrics, which I think is great, but sometimes there's steps that you want to show. We have had some successes, but we maybe have not met the overall metric or progress or whatever.
It's a great question, and being familiar with and having formerly worked for some of the Maryland report card producing folks over at the EcoCheck and Ian group. That's something that they really focus on is having measurable sort of trends that you can track per year instead of an overall that the Chesapeake Bay gets an F, for example. And I think that it is hard. One thing that we have seen folks do is sort of pairing tracking actions and progress towards those actions along with some of these indicators. I think we really were trying to do something different with this project, which is not measure effort and measure outcomes. And we felt like that was something that was missing from the resilience space because we do a lot of tracking of effort. But I think there could be ways to pair sort of the progress and also potentially zoom in on specific areas to tell the story of something that might have changed. So if you're doing a resilience project that, for example, draws folks out of the floodplain, and maybe it's a reinforced park that helps protect a neighborhood, that might be something that results in a better resilience score for that neighborhood. And if you do want to highlight just, this is a different thing, but your idea that you're thinking about of something that the neighborhood scale that could use sort of the checklist idea that like an advocate in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Kate was saying, I think something about this is that once you have the indicator, it doesn't necessarily have to be used at the city or the state level, right? Like as long as the data is available, this could very much be used at the neighborhood scale to tell a story or like to kind of emphasize on or to like showcase any action or successes. And so, yeah, the idea of a checklist was just to have simple indicators that community organizations could use to kind of like assess their neighborhood quickly and easily, as a way to assess like it. So that checklist, like it's something that could be done under a particular theme, right? So like, for instance, if the effort was done around tree planting, then you could take the indicators under that particular theme and then just run with that and go by that. Or like you could pair a couple of themes together. For instance, something like a green infrastructure type project will also presumably impact something like the social demographics of the place, or like impact something like housing, because these things all work together. And so pairing together themes and indicators that impact each other and then using them in combination, which is why the themes are important, so that you can look at a particular theme rather than combining it all and trying to do it all at a big scale. Like it can be small scale, one or two goal types, and then starting small and then building up.
So I think there's an opportunity through storytelling to sort of zoom into where you have made changes on a specific indicator, really zoom in and work with the community to tell that story. But yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to do it. It's a really great question, and if the state wants to do this, and if we're able to help New Jersey in their effort, there's a lot of calibration that would have to be done to sort of get there, and I've done a little work on that, but not specifically for this project yet.
Great. Time for one more question if there is one, or any final thoughts? All right, well, thank you, Kate and Anushi, for a wonderful presentation and for all the work there. And as we continue to explore what we're going to do here in Maryland, we may be back in touch for sure on some support. So feel free to continue to listen in if you would like, but we're going to turn it now to Mike Henson, with the Office of Resilience, for an update on what y'all are doing over there.
Thanks so much.
Right, do you want to start up there?
You can just sit right there. I think we're good. And you want my laptop? You can advance the slide yourself, or I can do it for you.
You can do it. Oh, we don't have that.
I'll go really fast.
All right, well, yeah, I'm Mike Henson, Chief Resilience Officer for the state of Maryland. And with me, I'm Summer Montalfino, a Deputy CRO. You can go to the next slide. Today, we just wanted to take a minute to give you a couple quick updates, mostly about the resilience strategy, a couple small things also about the office, and just some headline things that have happened. I haven't really had a chance to address this group in quite a while, I think, or maybe at all, actually, to this point.
I think Summer did the last.
Oh, Summer did, okay, yeah. So excited to give you an update on where we're at. We have a lot going. So we'll make this concise and clear, and have time for questions if anybody has any. So getting into things right away, just for a little bit of background, for those of you who have been in any of our meetings, I apologize if this is like the 5th time you've heard this, such as Ryland, but I'll make it pretty quick. So our enabling legislation happened in 2022. And just the way things work, it took a little while for things to move. I was brought on board in very late 2023, and we were able to get Summer and our other staff members on board in spring 2024. And so with that, we're able to start really focusing on some of the key areas that our office was created to do. And that would be, of course, resilience across state agencies, providing local governments technical assistance when possible around resilience, and ensuring that resilience investments are made with a focus on environmental justice. One of the biggest things that was in our legislation was also around the creation of a statewide resilience strategy, which once again we'll be diving into pretty deep today. Additionally, we also had an executive order that went through in early September of 2024, which more or less supported what was already in the legislation. It's wonderful to have something legislated. It's even better to have it in the EO as well. So we're lucky enough to have both of those things happen. Additionally, the executive order also called for the creation of positions that are agency resilience liaisons. And so that's been really helpful as we've worked through the strategy process. We've set up a communication tiering system that's worked really well. And the agency resilience liaisons give us a mechanism to do that when their strategy is done, to keep having those connections to all the agencies, all principal departments, along with a couple other administrations were included in that. So we have a touch point for all of the state of Maryland government, which is fantastic. We've had great participation and feedback from that group to this point, and hopefully it just continues to grow. Next slide. All right. Defining resilience, one of the first things we did when we came in to start the office was we had to determine what resilience was going to mean for our office and more generally for the state through these combined efforts we're doing across government. With the help of this group, and folks in this group specifically, we're able to provide a survey to a large number of stakeholders that requested both qualitative and quantitative data from them, and we were able to winnow that down into the definition you see in front of you here, which basically touched on all major themes that were identified in that survey process. And we workshopped it with a lot of the stakeholders as well. We received feedback from dozens of stakeholders in state government, local government, academia, as well as our few nonprofit partners as well. So the definition, I won't read it for you here, but it is available to you. Also, if anyone has any questions around the creation of that, we have a great process document on it. It kind of explains everything we did and how we got to this definition in particular. And while it is a very wordy and broad definition, it does give us the range we need to do this job well, while also giving us some guardrails so that we can make sure we're remaining mission focused. So as far as the strategy is concerned, this is our priority for this year in 2025. We've already done some pre-work for it, which Summer will get into in just a minute. But this is really like the main focus of our office as we move forward. And so with that, one of the main things that we are focusing on to start is the establishing a shared picture of hazards and stressors across the state. For those who aren't aware, hazard is very acute. There's an inciting incident or event. Stressors are more of existing conditions that can exacerbate problems when a hazard does arise. Crosswalking of existing plans and programs. We requested, through our great partners, we requested some feedback on existing projects, programs and plans, and we got 39 that were already directly related to resilience or tangentially related to resilience. So we were able to work through some of that and come up with some of those key plans and begin crosswalking them. Once again, Summer will get into that a little bit more. And then the next two things you see here have to deal with goal setting and prioritization criteria. That's something else that we're really going to focus on as we work a little bit further through the strategy. And then our last one here is developing framework for place-based resilience. And this is a key point that I want to focus on a little bit here. Is not just having a strategy for the state, which is great. Having the statewide strategy is fantastic and allows us to all work together toward the common goal. However, we wanted to really highlight where are the geographies across Maryland where we have the greatest mix of vulnerability to climate impacts, community vulnerability, and where we can move the needle the most with the programs and projects that we have in place already. And as we focus on where we want to go, where can we really move that needle the most and get quite frankly, the best return on our resilience investments. So that is a big outcome of this plan, or excuse me, the strategy as well. Next slide. Is this me or you on this? Oh, okay. This is so a quick overview of the outline of the strategy. You can see on the slide here, it's obviously executive summary. And then we'll move into the meat of the plan, which is, reviewing of the existing resilience work. As I mentioned, there were that stack of 39 things, if you will, that we began crosswalking and reviewing. That's been winnowed down to about 13, I believe. And they're being, cross-referenced and really going through all the recommendations, trying to find common themes, trying to find gaps and all those things. So kind of working through all that. Then there are sector chapters. So we've created 5 sectors, which we'll get into in a little bit, but there's 5 separate sectors and then 3 focus areas. Actually, just coming out of the last presentation we just saw, I thought that was interesting. They also had sectors and focus areas.
That was next.
What was that?
That was next.
That was next. Yeah, I did. I was just saying it's good that we have similarities in the way these things are set up, to recognize that while we have sectors, there are also just overarching things that are that we have to consider in all of the sectors that we look at, these lenses that we have to look through for the various sectors. And I already talked about place-based resilience framework, so that's obviously going to be a part of this as well. Just to talk about how we can take these high-level strategies and ideas and where can we actually implement the greatest change. And then a summary of recommendations. And Summer will probably get more into this in a second, but we want to make sure that those recommendations are high level and give us a lot of clear direction on some real priorities on where we want to go. We're looking for quality and executability as opposed to quantity. And so I think that'll help us as a state be able to focus better on where we're moving our money and our efforts to. And next slide.
Great. So yeah, getting into the crosswalk of existing plans, this is exactly what Mike was talking about, where we started with a list of about 39, winnowed it down to the 13 that you see on this slide. And our intent here was recognizing that there's so much resilience work already happening in Maryland. You can kind of encapsulate some of that by looking at plans. We're also having tons of conversations about things other than plans that pertain to work that's already going on resilience. A few things that we think are really important for the strategy are that it's additive, not duplicative, that it builds off of major themes within existing plans, but also if we see that there's gaps or areas that haven't been covered as much, that we can use the strategy as an opportunity to tackle things that maybe weren't in scope for some of these other pieces. So you'll see it's very tiny for us in the room, but you'll see next gen adaptation plan. It's only last on the list because it's most recent, but first in all of our hearts. We also have the state hazard mitigation plan, the saltwater intrusion and salinization plan update that happened recently. Kind of all the usual suspects you'd expect, also looking at the energy security plan. And our intent in doing this was to go through, pull out all of the recommendations, all the actions, see what time frame they were on, who's owning what might be lacking owners, look at what sectors are covered by what plans, and again, evaluate what are the themes, what are some of the areas or opportunities, or gaps that we can address further in this one. One thing that is really interesting that came out of the crosswalk, I think from our perspective, is that housing has not been covered that substantially in a lot of the plans that we looked at. And so if there's anyone on the line who's aware of plans that we have not, let us know. We very well may have missed things, but I think all of us recognize that climate change and hazards meet people on their doorsteps. We know that that's a really important area to focus on. And I think it highlighted for us, and we'll talk about this more with the sectors, a potential area to really focus in further and start that thinking. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so with that, we've talked a little bit about sectors and focus areas already today. I promise we're not reinventing the wheel with something totally different from Next Gen, but since we have a slightly different scope, which is broad in the sense of including all hazards within the state hazard mitigation plan, as well as climate impacts, we're thinking about the sectors a little bit differently, but with a lot of similarities to Next Gen. And I think there's even more similarities within the focus areas. So you can see at the top, we've got 5 sectors: environment and natural systems. I think that's a very well-trod sector in Maryland. We know there's tons of great recommendations out there already for that. I think this is an opportunity to synthesize and kind of, use this strategy as a way to elevate some of what we know are already good ideas out there. Food systems. Some folks know that our office also convenes the Food System Resiliency Council, which is a body that makes recommendations on food system resilience. So that's something really natural to kind of have its own sector within this strategy. I mentioned housing already, and it was interesting to hear the previous presentation talk about shelter as one of the themes that they honed in on. Community and local government capacity. Mike mentioned that one of the goals of our office is to provide local technical assistance and support local governments with developing their own resilience strategies. So for us, it's very important that we have that as its own sector so we can get clear on where the greatest needs are so that we're investing in the things that are actually of greatest value. And then finally, critical infrastructure, which is always a fun one because those two words can mean a myriad of different things. We have a specific way that we're defining it that is pretty high level. So we're thinking about transportation, drinking water and wastewater, energy assets, hazardous materials. We're thinking about safety and security, military installations, and that's kind of broadly what we're talking about. I know there's a lot of other things that could be included. We're trying to set some guardrails here. So as you can see, we realize we already have a pretty big scope. In terms of the focus areas, these are going to be the areas that kind of cut across the entire strategy. So we've got justice and equity, place-based resilience, which Mike already touched on, and then robust economy and job creation. At the bottom, you can see our plan for stakeholder engagement. So for each of the 5 sectors, we have sector work groups that have started to meet. We've had one set of meetings with all of the sector work groups, and we have another one coming up. In addition to that, we're using kind of a mix of surveys and interviews to get feedback from additional stakeholders. The goal here is to really try and have as many people as possible that have expertise, being mindful that, everyone has their own commitments and we want to respect people's time. But also trying to use this as an opportunity to bring in different voices than maybe have been involved in some of the other plans. We can go to the next one. Okay, so with that, We wanted to, really brag a little and give you a snapshot of some of the people that we've talked to already. So we've engaged about 87 stakeholders already through the work groups. I should mention, for those who don't know, our office is within the Department of Emergency Management. So that 87 stakeholders does not include offices of emergency management. We've also reached out to. But the stakeholders we've engaged include state entities, local governments from all regions of the state. Having regional representation across the state is really important to us. We're happy that we have representation from all regions, but we are going to push ourselves to make sure it stays that way and that we're really building that out. We have both resilience authorities participating in this process, as well as the Montgomery County Clean Bank. We've been speaking with nonprofits and CEOs, private sectors, business, universities, you name it, we're reaching out to people. But 87 is a big number or a small number, depending on which way you look at it. So we're really always looking for thoughts on additional people we should interview. So if you are interested in being interviewed, especially, a lot of people in this room are talking to us, but if you're not and you would like to, or you have someone to recommend, definitely let me or Mike know. We can go to the next one. Okay, I think this is the last one for me. The left-hand side, we've kind of covered a lot of this. It's just about the work group structure. The right-hand side, this is what we're driving toward. So the idea is that we want to have kind of like tearaway sheets, it'll probably be more than a couple pages, for each of the sectors that have a definition of what that sector includes, a discussion of the hazards and stressors. So for our purposes, that really means how are some of the key hazards that will be discussed in the hazard mitigation plan affecting the sector, and how is climate change affecting this sector, and some other kind of discussion of stressors within that. You can imagine that's going to look really different if we're talking about critical infrastructure versus our natural systems versus housing. Then we'll talk about the existing plans and programs that exist, because I think that is really important to sort of set the table with an understanding of what resources are already in place. And then we'll have the discussion of challenges and needs, which is starting to come out through these work group discussions. And then, the kind of like big piece of it is really those 2, 5, and 10-year recommendations. I do want to note, and Jennifer made a good point, which is on all of our minds, we're in a tricky situation when it comes to budgets and federal funding. So we are trying to be thoughtful and mindful of recommendations, really thinking of recommendations that have a cost associated and also those that don't. So are there more policy recommendations that can be made as opposed to recommendations about specific funding objectives? So that's something we're going to be looking to balance. With that, I think it goes back to Mike.
Sure. So timeline for this strategy, you'll see it very small in front of you for those in the room, so I apologize about that. But essentially, you can see there that this already really began last year with quarter 3 and 4, and crosswalking, all those things we talked about. Right now, we're getting into the second to last section there, if you will, but essentially, working on moving from those work groups into prioritizing actions and things like that, which we'll really start getting into as we move into quarter 2. But you can see that what we really hope to have here is that as we get into the late summer and fall, we essentially have a lot of the input and information gathering, data collection side of things done, and allow our folks internally to hopefully get that strategy completed, drafted, get feedback on it from all the pertinent stakeholders, and then have it finalized by the end of this calendar year and available to share and hopefully, give you another presentation at some point where we can talk more about the 2, 5, and 10-year recommendations. Additionally, something that didn't make it onto the slides here, but I just want to mention is that the 2, 5, and 10-year recommendations are directly tied to the legislation and the executive order. Those were requirements there. So that is why we're kind of housing them like that. And we'll plan to kind of maintain those on an annual basis, kind of how we maintain not only the strategy and make sure that we're coming back to that and grounding it annually, but also making sure that those strategies are updated on or those 2, 5, and 10-year strategies are updated on a regular basis, so that once again, we're meeting the reality of whatever the situation may be budget wise, priority wise, we deal with changing scopes in government on a regular basis, and we make sure we're cognizant of that maintenance strategy as well. And I think that might be it. Yeah, there we go. So we'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions. I know we just kind of dumped all of that on you all fairly quickly, but happy to take any questions about strategy, about the office, anything in between.
Right? Questions in the room are, again, raise your hand or add it to the chat online.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, that was tour de force. Congratulations on this work. That's a lot. Thank you. I do have the same question about climate budget tagging, and whether you're working with the controller on that. The controller is particularly interested in creating a statewide thing that connects to how it's being done systematically around the world. Also, you did mention the importance of the ROI, and also you mentioned the importance of looking in a new budget reality at how we have an impact. I'm wondering about how you think about partnering with community organizations, nonprofits, or faith groups, or just private individuals to get them to play a greater role. I'll just give you a personal example. I live in Annapolis. We are constantly flooding in our neighborhood. Our neighborhood got a grant plus put up private money to create a plan to build resiliency that then would go out for grants. Now there seems to be no grants to go out for, but we've spent a lot of money preparing for the permitting and the grants that don't exist. And so I just wonder how you're thinking about those sorts of issues, which are going to impact people across the state.
Sure. Sorry. Yeah. So first thing, it's your question, the timing of your question, the first question is fantastic. We're actually having a meeting with them tomorrow about that, the controller about the tagging. So I don't have any specific outcomes on that yet, but it's definitely something that is in the works, hopefully in the works, and something that would be absolutely supported by us, and we're going to hopefully be able to work out some details, and that would be a great outcome if we could put something like that into place. Especially based on the question you had previously, like there's outcomes there that are great, but also for us, it's just a key, like a baseline of where are we really. I think it's tough to talk about where you want to place investments, but there's not a clear picture of what's already been invested and what's currently being invested. And so I think that that's a huge thing for us, and we're excited about the possibilities of that in the near future. So certainly by the next time I see you, hopefully have some kind of more concrete update of where that's going. And yeah, so that's great. As far as the second point that you make, there's no clear answer. It's right. It's not easy. I think that it's great that you're like talking specifically about your specific situation in Annapolis there. You've taken the right steps and you've prepared so that hopefully when funding comes back, you're in a good position. But I think that's a tough situation. We're going to have that same conversation with, you're talking about the community level, but at the county or the municipal level, we're going to have the same conversations about why this is an important investment of time and effort and a financial investment to make for these communities, because we know that eventually there will be funding coming back, whether that funding is from the federal government, or if we have to make changes and talk about that more at the state level, or whether that's through philanthropic endeavors. And to that point, I'll actually pass it to Summer if you want to talk a little bit more about anything around that and how we're kind of engaging other groups.
Yeah, what specifically are you?
I'm just, no. So I'm just wondering, we're dealing with other, community-based organizations that are kind of involved in what we're doing. And I think that while we're focusing right now on the federal and state side of, funding, I think we do have a pretty solid plan that we realize that eventually we're going to have to move into how do we bring in philanthropic groups to be a part of this? How do we talk and deal with the private sector about their responsibilities and their roles in this as well? This is not something that we can just do on an individual level. It's not something we can just handle at the state. It's not something that we can expect just the federal government to handle either. It is an all of us working together scenario. And so I think while right now strategy is focusing on what we at the state can do and how we can help locals get there, the broader picture, I think, would be that eventually we start really branching out into all the various avenues for funding. And where we can start to try and marry those together with the strategy to once again have like the biggest impact return on investment we can.
If I can just react to what you just said. So first of all, thank you. There's money that the state spends, and then there's money that climate costs the state that is not what we spend. So I'll give you an example. Across the state, there's significant area that you all are mapping as places where we can no longer build. It's no longer safe to build. There are many places where you cannot no longer buy flood insurance. So you can't, if you can't buy flood insurance, you can't get a mortgage, which means that if somebody has generational wealth put into their home, they can no longer sell their home to someone who needs a mortgage to purchase the home. So those kinds of costs need to be a part of the climate budget tagging of how we think about costs to the state. And I'd say that's very important because it seems easy for the state to cut the budget of this department because they say, who really cares about a shoreline? But they do care a lot about the fact that generational wealth is lost when you cannot resell your house or you cannot build a farm on that property. So I just wanted to raise that. Also, this commission overall has repeatedly, at least since I've joined it 2 years, we have suggested a public education campaign to engage the public in resiliency and understanding climate issues. And not a single bill, despite there being over 100 climate bills, not a single one of the new bills addresses public education around climate resiliency. And so I just want to point out that if we want to have public-private partnership, we need to do something to create that.
So if I can just respond real quick, I'm sorry for taking up too much.
It's just me. Yeah.
Just real quick, just to kind of tag on to what you said at the end there about the public side of things, public facing side, in our work groups that we just had for the sectors, that was something that came up on several work groups about the outreach piece. So that is being supported and reiterated in the work that we're seeing. So that is a positive thing. As far as, not positive that there hasn't been a bill that you're suggesting, but I would say as a follow-up to that though, if we could propose one more time, I think it'd probably be worthwhile for us to have a separate interview, like you said, with you about some of these things.
That's great. And for others who are interested, the only other question is, Summer, we contact you if they're interested in engaging.
Yes, yeah, contact me and I think Rylan can share my contact info.
Yeah.
Perfect.
You can also put it in the chat.
Oh, fix it up.
All right, so next on our agenda, something also important to,
Hold on, I'll have you looked at the cohesive wildfire strategy, the regional one?
So I don't know that
We have not.
Yeah.
Because I didn't see what all the plans,
Yeah, so while we haven't, I know that within MDEM and other people who are part of our this play, that people have looked at that. I actually just had a separate presentation where I have to speak about that. So somebody has looked at it, but not directly against what we're working on here, but that's something that we can definitely take a look at.
Yeah, I mean, it's all related to just adaptation management and planning.
okay, great. Next on our agenda is about next gen tracking, which is also going to be important to what we just heard about for state strategies and resilience and how we're going to track that. So, Rylan, I will turn it over to you to lead that discussion.
Thank you. So hopefully this is slightly larger, but so what I'm going to be talking about here, and the main takeaway is not necessarily the content on the screens. Don't worry about that so much. But what we are in the stage of tackling now that we've done an excellent job producing next gen is tracking progress. And so that is obviously a beast. We have a lot in there and a lot of time that it will take to get to tracking this. But one of the first things we wanted to do right off the bat here is we all, I think, know that the plan came out in August, but we had kind of took a lot of time in post-production, I'll call it, to get the plan out. So we're now at a time period where it's been probably generously a year, maybe plus or minus some months, And has there been any progress made inherently, right? I don't think anybody has forgotten about Next Gen, and a lot of this that was put in here was from agency leads who are speaking to things that are already ongoing in their agency. So we have some suspicion that progress has been made without knowing that progress has been made. So what we did here and what this table is showing is kind of a quick high-level gut check using the table that exists in the appendix of Next Gen, which is separated out for each individual agency and has those identified actions that each agency was tagged with in Next Gen. And we took just that high-level overview of had progress been made. We have not started, which is not necessarily a bad thing, so we're trying to keep that in mind here. We have in progress, which is obviously a very wide range of actions that could encompass that. And then, of course, we have completed. But this, I think, is a great opportunity for us to all reflect back on what we wrote, a year ago in many cases, and to see, are we actually making progress without having to put in that extra effort, or where do we need to invest those resources? And we all do know that there is an investment needed section of priorities, which may take more effort, but it's great to see if, given the fact that we wrote these words on paper, are these initiatives already taking root in other agencies? So I'm just going to give you this high-level overview. I'm not going to go into how we got to these assessments for each one, because that would take entirely too long, and I don't think we need to go into the minutia here. But what I want to discuss after I go through this table is a quick discussion about whether each agency should be presenting this appendix table to the ARWG at upcoming meetings, whether we think that's a feasible option, whether we think that helps us make some amount of progress towards our Next Gen goals. And if so, or if not, what are some other viable options on tracking, or what would you like to see in terms of measuring progress and tracking progress here? So it's a big discussion, but I just want to show you here that I think we have made some good progress. There are some things that are not started. So what the columns we have here, of course, just to reorient you, column A is whether that it is a resource ready or investment needed priority. And those are those two categorized priorities in Next Gen. Then we have just that priority number, so you can find it, whether the time frame in Next Gen was expected to be short, mid, or long. Any other collaborators, because remember, all of these tasks are exclusively ones that DNR is tasked with. And then column D would be who else is going to be working on that task with us. And then, of course, that little summary of what that task entails, which sometimes is very, very general. So we'll work on that in a minute. And then column F is the one that I added. That is that indicator of progress. So first we have water resources, which as a whole, I'm just going to scroll through the whole. We do have a lot of things that are in progress, but we do have quite a few that are not started. And I think a lot of those are going to be more of the interagency efforts that take a lot of that combined change, and that are probably a little harder to get off the ground as one single agency. So when I see that, my mind is flagging, okay, let's circle back with our partners on some of these not started efforts, specifically looking at more of the short term. Why haven't the short term, which I should say we defined as 0 to 2 years, why are we having trouble getting those off the ground? And is there anything we can do to move those forward? So that's what I'm reading when I read this. Then scrolling down.
It might be helpful to looking at like where one of them is completed. It might be able to have a column to like link to that single rise training guidance, right? Like any resources that would be helpful to like say, here's where it's finished would be useful.
Yeah, that's right. Providing.
And Rylan, how many agencies are involved in this? Just every agency in the state government, or just the core?
Any
environmental?
agency that was tagged, I don't have the number offhand, but it is in the appendix of Next Gen, so I can check and get back to you on that one. It's not going to be every agency. There's some of the smaller ones and stuff like that. So human health, we only have one because that is obviously more of a Department of Health centered sector group, but we do have a specific priority centered around the access to green space, which of course is a big DNR priority. So that we would say is in progress. But again, on this, we'd want to circle back with the whole team and make sure everybody feels like we are making in progress, and do they need extra support from their partner agencies in this. So the two sections that are going to be biggest for DNR here, of course, are working lands and natural resource-based economies. And I am very happy to say we have a ton of in progress again here, not started. Once again, we're going to be looking at our partners. So this was really a trifecta of agencies that are kind of equally leading this, not agencies, excuse me, groups or interests. We have forestry, fisheries, and agriculture are the three main parts that make up this working lands sector group. And so we are really just speaking in this table to forestry and fisheries, since that's DNR's portion of it. We're not speaking to agriculture's portion of it. So I don't want to offend anybody from agriculture in the room, but this is something, again, we'll want to be touching base and working together towards that working lands objective, even though we're going to be doing it in different ways, but making sure we are supporting each other towards making progress on those unified goals. And then finally, of course, we have the natural resources and ecosystem section, which is very heavily DNR based, and a smattering of not started, but very many things again in progress. But as you'll see, almost every single item on these tables have partners and collaborators. So that's where it's really important to maintain contact, get back with the people that you're working with. Even if you are identified as the lead on something, that does not mean you are the sole person responsible for making progress. So trying to bring us all back together and emphasize that collaboration is really what's going to help us move forward. So after showing you this very quick look at our table here, I want to open the floor to, first of all, what are thoughts about asking each of our agency partners to fill out this table on behalf of their agency? How do we feel about that? We got one thumbs up. We got a couple thumbs up in
I
there.
think you need to do that. How do we do it in a way that not only helps us fill in the column, but brings us together to the point where we can make a little bit of progress on the thing or identify, I'm working on this soil health thing and it is, it's in here, but it also relates to that. How do you encourage that little bit of progress while you're checking progress?
Yes, that's exactly right. I think, having us take a look back at it will open the floor to, oh, this is actually a lot harder than we thought it was going to be when we wrote it, or things like that might come up. But I think the first step is going to be taking a look at it again. Tell us how you feel now a year later. And I think we've always tried to emphasize with NextGen that we can modify things as needed. I don't think if it's not working as written, we're not going to nail ourselves to the wall on this one. Let's get back together as a group and discuss this. And I think opening the floor, having everybody take that look back will have that discussion hopefully come naturally.
A couple of questions and one piece of immediate feedback kind of to Anne's point. I think as far as utilizing this, I think it could be really helpful to have a tab in this spreadsheet. I find instruction tabs really helpful for spreadsheets like this. It just gives like a legend of what all the columns are, kind of the details around it, like the priority numbers for tracking. It's not necessarily saying that that's the #1 priority, or if it is, whatever the ranking, and then just having an instruction like expected to fill out column G and put the links in column H, or just so that there's consistency in the way the spreadsheet is being utilized. That's the feedback, and then I have a couple questions. Sorry. You mentioned kind of trying to tackle like what wasn't started and like finding those intersection points. And just to confirm, like, is that going to be functionally done through ARWG, or would it be something where my work's maybe not moving as fast, or I need help from Anne, and then I would reach out directly, like the kind of the process piece of it, which we may not have figured out yet. And then
Can I answer that real quick?
yes, yeah.
So I think that that would be a great platform to start at the next ARWG meeting, but then carry out probably independently. So I just don't think it's going to be feasible to make progress with only 4 meetings a year.
Yes.
And we definitely don't need to convene the whole group every single time. It's
That's our subgroup activity.
Yeah. And then just the last two questions kind of relate to that as far as connecting outside of ARWG are there specific point of contacts for the agencies that are going to be listed in the spreadsheet, and then tied to that, is this public or is it is this tracking spreadsheet? Because I know that conversation came up with the framework like years and years ago, was do we create a website where we show, we publicize, whatever, put on the public, whatever the word is, put it online so that the public can see our progress? Or is this gonna be more kind of behind, the state walls? And I think that ties into, it was a question I flagged, but I knew that this conversation was coming up, so I didn't ask it for the MDM ones. But around that, like, how are we tracking and how are we communicating about that? And then what are I don't know if agencies are gonna have different comfort levels with film detail and stuff.
I can definitely say I'm gonna anticipate that some people will be very concerned about immediately publicizing it. But I do think that there is a public accountability portion. We want to acknowledge that people are, and Next Gen Progress is one of the governor's KPIs. So I should point that out too. So I think we should work towards that. I don't think there's any need to be like, this table is published next week. But that should definitely come up in our discussion because we do have accountability. And then as for the agency leads too, let me get back with the people that we have identified as the leads first, make sure everything is the same before I send anything out, plowing them into those contacts.
There's also the resilience liaisons.
Yes.
With-
Yeah, we could also,
And one last little question, more just like an ask honestly to you for ARWG, is I think getting into this KPI reporting, the other reports that we all have, I know NDOT's undertaking to like, how do we streamline and stop asking for similar updates for climate and climate adjacent stuff multiple times throughout the year? It'd be really helpful, I think, to hear from the other agencies about where they're able to streamline. So like, are they pulling information out of their state agency report? Like, just understanding the how of what other agencies are doing. I think so that we all don't have to start from scratch to figure out how we're tracking this and we can kind of leverage that. Maybe that's a meeting topic, I don't know, but.
yeah, great. Thank you.
So my thing is about the in progress versus ongoing, like some are going to be just like, they don't have an endpoint, right? We're just doing them constantly versus in progress to an endpoint. And so I don't know if you've thought about a distinction there of things that just are just continually ongoing.
We did have an intern last summer who started to parse out specific measurable pieces from Next Gen because not every single thing was implicitly measurable. And so we started towards that. And in that process, she had also started to identify anything that was going to be a one and done or that was going to be more of an ongoing. And so we had kind of started that, but obviously she was only here for that brief period. And so we're still working towards it. But I think as a group, we need to sort of figure out how we're going to parse out those different styles of metrics too, which I'm hoping, maybe in further conversation with Kate and Anushi, we can get some of their advice on that. Probably should have asked that earlier, but here we are. They're still on. Yeah, working towards that.
So who is responsible for tracking? If you had a summer intern who's no longer here, is there one neck to grab that is responsible?
To be clear, we're not, the intern wasn't necessarily responsible for tracking. She was supporting our work tracking. Yeah. So that was just one facet of
So
it.
of all the agencies, your agency is responsible for measuring all the other agencies' stuff or no?
Put it back on these agencies themselves. And that's why we're going to say, please fill out this table. DNR is not going to fill out a table for MDEV, for example. We want this to be an ARWG effort. Yes, we are the chair of the ARWG, so we'll be kind of leading the charge, directing the charge. But we don't want this to be a DNR effort. We want to own our piece of it and kind of put ourselves up as an example. But this very much needs to be a collaborative effort. I'll stop.
But you're the centralizing tracking.
Yes, we'll be facilitating.
Is there any thought to, how we help this plan navigate some of the changes? We've already talked about some of the rapid changes in federal funding. But I think there's a lot of other change coming, for example, FEMA. There's a lot of remaking of the universe. Part of our resilience here is gonna have to be taken a real hard look at what's going on, how that affects state capacities. There is a lot of interest in having very strong state leadership. The current scenario like that, I know as state forester, I've gotten no communication about what state roles or what states might contribute to such a reorganization as may be underway. So just that this whole situation, I think it would be helpful if we make some statement that we need our federal partners to be communicating some of these things that are, particularly things that are part of the emergency response.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think next gen is still strong. I mean, it's a strong state document for like what we want to accomplish. And I think you may be right that at some point we may have to look at it and see what's still accomplishable. But I think at this point it's just changing so much and nothing's clear that I think as long as we continue to focus on these things that these agencies are the lead of, then at some point we'll have to revisit it if there is a new landscape that we're working on.
Yeah, I guess my only point would be like, requested communications and state input. If there is some thought to changing the relationship between state and federal partnerships that we've had over the long term in many of these scenarios.
So along those lines, the Climate Commission did endorse trying to hold polluters accountable through legislation that would seek funding from fossil fuel companies that would then go into resiliency and other kinds of things. However, it did get somewhat watered down from the administration that wanted that to be a study as opposed to a process. And I just want to flag that from what I understand and behind the scenes, that already the environmental budget of the state, I'm not talking about the federal, is the state is looking at $220 million in cuts, 40 million in new cuts yesterday. So that's pretty catastrophic. And that if we don't get money from fossil fuel companies, I don't know what, who made this mess in the first place. I don't know what money we have. It's not that we can just put it on the federal government, given the state cuts that are potentially coming.
I think I want to reemphasize the flexibility that we'd like to keep in this document. Yes, we've written those words, but nobody would expect those words to be written in stone, especially given, situations we would not have seen coming per se. And so the ability to adapt and change, I think we would work as a group. And that's why I think the subgroups become more important because the ARWG might not be poised to decide how forestry pivots in these times, but you can, help discuss what's in next gen and what needs to change given your changing circumstances as well. And so maybe that's something we'll probably have to address down the road too. If we're changing next gen,
Just need information on what's changing.
Yeah, I can't do that for you. Yeah. So discussing how we address, changes that probably will need to be made is, I think, a conversation we should have down the road once everyone's taken that look back and see just what are we talking about here? Do we need to erase entire priorities? My gut would say no, but how do we pivot? So for future conversation.
Anything online, any comments or questions? Yeah, Jim.
It's really great to see, oops, my camera's off.
Jim, go
Really
ahead.
great to see that you're tracking all this stuff. And we are as well at MDE.
Can you hear us online?
Ours is online. And it would be great if we could compare notes to make sure that one, we're still aligned.
They don't work for the in-room speaking.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it'd be good to make sure we're still aligned with our action items as well as our progress. I'm sorry, you can't hear me?
Okay, maybe not.
I can hear you, Jim, but I think it sounds like they can't hear you in the room.
Okay.
Yeah. Been one of those.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, you know what? That happened once before.
Jim, maybe you can throw some of your comments in the chat.
There it is.
Yeah, thanks, Brandy.
One time I did have to just click back. All right, Jim, now we can hear you. Could you speak up one more time? I'm so sorry.
I was just praising you on all the great work you've done, but also saying that we should revisit the various action items as well as the progress on those action items. For instance, we have made some progress on living shorelines. Are we tracking the same thing? I'm not 100% sure of that. So it'd be good to get back together and do that alignment.
Yes, fully agree. Thank you so much, Jim, and sorry we were having trouble hearing you there. Our
problem.
sound went out and we had no idea. We're just gonna have to be really quiet for the last couple. Okay, so final call for discussion points, question on next gen tracking progress. Our actions, from what I'm reading from our discussion, is that I will be reaching out to agency leads, just who I have contact with, and seeing who they want to kind of run point on this, then providing a contact list out. I believe I'll just start that out with our membership list, so it's not going to be that public list that goes out to everybody, so don't be too alarmed with that. And then the expectation will be that either, well, I guess the question here, should we expect this by May, or do we think that we need a longer timeline for just filling out this table at a high level? Full disclosure, I was able to fill it out relatively quickly for my agency, but I will let you all speak for yourselves.
I think more time could be detrimental, because I think if you give 6 months, it's, yeah, people are gonna take 6 months. Myself included. That's some self-aware comment.
Okay, so May, agency's expectation to fill out the table, and I will be in discussion with you all to make sure everybody has what they need to do that. Okay, great. Then we are transitioning to. Huh?
Elliot had a comment.
Oh, sorry, Elliot.
Quick. Would it be appropriate in this spreadsheet to identify parallel efforts that could potentially be leveraged to accomplish some of these tasks?
Absolutely, yeah. I think the spreadsheets can be used in whatever way is most helpful to everybody. There is no rigidity, I think, in the spreadsheet format. I just pulled out something that I knew everybody had an opportunity to see and look at. I didn't want anybody to be surprised by tasks that came out. And so we can just make this our own as we see fit, and everyone else should feel received. Okay, now I'm doing a super smooth transition into the policy discussion section of the meeting. So as a reminder, this is just an open amount of time for anybody to bring up policy related agenda items. So this could pertain to current session items that we would like to discuss as the group. This could also pertain to anything maybe that happened this session that you would like to prepare for next session, or just ideas that you have and want to tee up for next session. And as a reminder, our avenue here as ARWG is that every year we are responsible for crafting recommendations that go to the Commission on Climate Change. And then the hope is that those recommendations are then later able to be picked up easily by a legislator to turn into legislation down the road. So our avenue is ultimately recommendations, but that being said, this is an open format for anything that anybody would like to discuss related to policy, past, present, or future. Yes.
I'll give a shout out to everyone working on the Maryland Flood Awareness Month proclamation. I heard in a Silver Jackets meeting yesterday, the day before, that is going forward, and congratulations, that's really exciting.
Yay. Yeah, go.
Well, I definitely want to push for climate budget tracking so that the state has actual accounting codes that when we spend money on climate, that we can track it, whether it's resiliency or whether it's mitigation, that we have a systematic way of tracking finances, and also to yet again have a recommendation on public education and engagement around climate solutions. which we seem to give only lip service to. But with lack of funding, we're going to need to do more.
How would the climate budgeting financial codes work? I mean, we have like funding source.
So if you go to the Maryland Climate Commission website, there's an actual report that was put together on state climate funding, and it is wildly inaccurate because agencies were given the opportunity to claim anything that was remotely related to climate as a climate expense. So if maybe the 10th reason that they did something was climate related, they were able to claim it as a climate expense. And hence 10% of state funding was shown to be climate related in the report that is the official report on climate spending, which we all know is not true. One question around climate budget tagging is whether or not we're going to call it all of the expense or just the incremental cost. So for example, if an organization needed new heater and they were going to get a fossil fuel heater compared to a heat pump, and then they buy the heat pump, they've been reporting 100% of the cost of the heat pump as a climate expense. They were going to buy a heater anyway. So was it more expensive? If it was more expensive, then only the incremental cost increase for it to be climate friendly should be noted as a climate expense. But instead, they accounted 100% of the heater, which made it look like we're spending a lot more money and like climate is a big boondoggle waste of money. Hence, it makes it easier for state legislators to say we're spending too much money on climate, let's start cutting that budget.
Forestry, it's like trees belong to a lot of our different goals. So in one, the watershed, when you're looking at what we're spending on water quality, you look at what we do with trees. If you're looking at climate, you're looking at what we do with trees. You're looking at resource-based economies, you're looking at what we do with trees. And it would be a nightmare just having to parse out real little incremental things. I mean, I really want to make sure we're focused on, are we getting the big things right? Are we investing money in the kind of places where it's really important?
Well, there are people who are experts in these sorts of things, and there are global standards in how to do this. What I will say is that charging the entire public transit system to a climate expense is probably not something we should be doing.
Food for thought.
Thank you. Food for thought.
Yeah. Any other items?
There's a chat question about an agency being assigned to map disadvantaged communities. So just want to make sure people are aware.
Yeah, MDE does that. I have EJ screen.
Just a quick follow-on, I think, to the budget piece, and I've been thinking, I think a couple meetings ago, we talked about like how to make the policy recommendations that come out of ARWG like more closely tied to like action, like more easy for legislators to pick up. And the state agency report has always seemed like a good avenue, at least for some of this climate work that we do, as far as like consistency in reporting. And so I'm wondering if there is, this already exists, this requirement already exists, and I pulled up the statute and it says each state agency is to review its planning, regulatory, and fiscal programs. So it's just a review. It's not necessarily like a full accounting. And then recommended policy, planning, regulatory, and fiscal changes, and same with the report of both mitigation. And so I'm wondering if like the recommendation can be like strengthening that specific language in that specific statute that specifies how to do that review of the fiscal, right? So it's not just a review, it's an accounting, and this is how you do the accounting. This is, it's not going to get into that level of detail in the statute. But the state agency report, which is nested under the Climate Commission legislation in statute, could be a good avenue to at least start getting closer, those incremental steps to get to this point that we need to better inform our decision making.
I think that's largely spearheaded by the University of Maryland, right? Elliot, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. But how do we expand that into resilience report as well?
It was consistent.
So, well,
Consistent.
They're tracking like I think if we wanted to do that line item tracking that Jennifer was describing, I think we would need to train fiscal staff on how to do it and adapt it into our fiscal tracking system. I'd be a little concerned about an unfunded mandate to do that because it's going to take resources, potentially take additional staff to do that. Because right now the greenhouse gas spending is Rylan and I that work on it, and we asked Ann and whoever that's working. So it's not something that we couldn't integrate that tracking into our existing system. Assessment.
So maybe the recommendation also includes a staff call. Like and they're just recommendations. No one here can tell the legislators what to do. But I think if that is where we think it needs to go for adaptation and resiliency, and we know that there needs to be staff capacity for that or training, whatever it is, workforce development, something that's included in the recommendation, and then the legislators can or can't do whatever they can do whatever they want with that recommendation.
It's essentially written itself, I think.
Any other final?
I had some backup topics since there's a little bit of time left over. I just wanted to pitch some thoughts that we had been talking about at DNR to the group, since they are adaptation related. Some of the things that we've been thinking about are, would it be beneficial for the state to have adaptation numerical goals? Do you think that tying ourselves to some of these numbers to sort of build in that, mandate towards progress, basically? Of course, the concern is going to be, this will probably be an unfunded mandate, like everything, but that being said, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't set goals, right? But I just wanted to put that thought out there to the group and see how does the group feel about some tying specific numbers to legislation.
Give an example of a number. What's a high number? What's a low number?
I don't have any right now. This is just something we discussed as sort of this. I mean, trees obviously will be a big, right? That's big on, and the trees I think are a great example of that. We have 5 million trees that tracks actually where trees.
Greenhouse gas production.
Right.
Miles of shoreline.
Yeah, miles of shoreline restored, so we can come up with them on the spot. Yeah. But yes, those are all along the lines of setting that eye in the sky target goal. Not to bog us down in we're not talking, I think, like 100 goals or maybe 20 goals. I think we're just talking very high level, sort of like the beginning of this conversation, very high level goals that then we have Next Gen and the resilience strategy to sort of tie towards that overall goal, I think, is the thought process.
I think the challenge you have is that, and especially, and this is the challenge everybody has with these resilience metrics, like those are miles restored, that's the resilience. It's not really the outcome on the resilience side, right? Because you could restore 200 miles of shoreline that have no people there or no,
Yeah.
And so like, it doesn't quite capture a resilience metric. Then you're dealing with these future uncertainty conditions. And so like, people have said, well, people that we take out of a floodway, right? But then the floodway is changing and we don't really know what the floodplain is going to be. And so like, then if these people that we think aren't in the floodplain and then they are, and then they flood, like we failed, right? Because we're basing it off of a future with action and a future without action, not a current status. Because basing it on a current status doesn't make sense, and you've got too much noise in the system. So it's incredibly challenging. Sure, sorry. And Mike have tackled as well, right? Incredibly challenging.
Yeah. All that said, I don't want to tell you whether you want to choose numeric goals or not. But I will say that the nature of our resilience work, which is some of it is tied into this, obviously, ours also goes into other areas outside of the natural environment. But knowing what we've looked at so far, I will say it's pretty tough, and especially with the current funding environment, it's you can put it, if you look at it one way and say it's very helpful because it's well, we're setting these goals and that gives us something to judge against and show how we're maybe not able to hit them due to a lack of funding from the federal level. But at the same time, it's also going to show that like we're not able to move any of these things. So at what point does it become counterproductive and you lose momentum? Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer.
Dangerous.
So, if you were to say, like, you know, what's really on my wish list? If you went over, because you know, universal resiliency stuff, right? But what are the things that you're not already doing that you think would move things? And can we like identify, okay, doesn't have to be like everything. It's just, what are the big things that get right? Isn't, you know, some of how are responding to emergencies and building up more individual that has to be short term, short term. It's that kind of thing that make a real difference given what's going to happen with our emergency response.
Well, let me be clear that this is 100% my opinion and not the strategy. But you know, as far as things where we could really move the needle, and I think where we could have big gains would be around extreme heat, which I know is not necessarily, I mean, it is tied into this group, but there's a lot of flood focus here. But heat is, I think, a larger impact item. It impacts personal health, it impacts trees. Yeah, and trees, it impacts all kinds of systems, and quite frankly, on a grander scale than flooding does even, which in flooding is a grand scale for the state of Maryland. So yeah, and that's, well, then you have the flood side of things where like a lot of the issues that we face were just hit upon, which is it's a moving target. We don't know how things are going to be 10 years from now. You know, the Atlas 14 is outdated. We know that what that means is different for every community. Like, because sometimes it's still applicable, sometimes it means nothing anymore, such as Ellicott City or places on the shore. So I think there is a lot of work that can be done around those two areas specifically. Obviously, we're very flood focused on the stuff that's talked about here, but I think a lot of movement can also happen in that extreme heat area. And what those exact outcomes are, I don't want to speak to because that's what we're probably going to talk about a lot in the strategy process. And I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I think we'd like to get all the stakeholders input on that.
I was just going to say that for me, having money is always my top priority. And so that's why I'm hoping that we hold polluters responsible for the damage they did. But I will also say if there's any hope of us ever getting federal grants, we're going to have a challenge because of how we define environmental justice in our state, that the word race and 15% people who are immigrants in certain areas, that qualifies you for EJ funding is such a non-starter with the Trump administration that I think at some point we need to have a conversation about, do we care so much about that definition as opposed to the level of toxins, the level of risk, the level of poverty, et cetera. And whether we can take those words out and still have the same or almost the same map and still qualify for federal funding. I think this is a really big question that we need to ask ourselves.
Yeah, it was just to Mike's point around, the point was well made around like the timing of things and the kind of progress that can be made. MDOT has a resilience metric now tied to our attainment report, and it's annual. And for the resilience piece, it is tied to miles of roadway and transit systems that are vulnerable to flooding. And while we do have a handle on a lot of the levers that would impact that, MDOT's not moving whole highways, right? We're not moving miles and miles and miles of highways. So even as we increase resiliency to some of them, or we reduce the flooding through stream bank improvements, or, you know, those type of things, we're still going to have a very significant amount of roadways in the state of Maryland that are vulnerable to flooding by the definition of ground using, which is the CS CRAB is our threshold for that. And then as the flooding gets worse and the CS CRAB continues to creep inward, like, it's kind of hard because we can be making all of these investments and making as much progress as we can, and that number might not come down. And then it looks like we're not actually making any improvements to our transportation system. Again, it's just transportation, but so I think the specific numbers can be really tricky in how to manage that.
doesn't mean it's not worth exploring and trying to figure out, but I think being able to the education piece, communicate effectively about what those metrics are saying and how quickly we can make progress on them. And that's also something we're trying to figure out. So if anyone has tips or tricks, let us know. So that's just kind of how we're trying to bring some of the quantitative stuff into resiliency because it is an effective tool for mitigation. I think it's a little easier to track. So it's not easy, but it's easier than resiliency.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to do miles of roadway that would have been flooded, but now aren't flooded as opposed to total miles of roadway and like the avoidance as a,
Yes.
as opposed to, yeah.
And also, is it just when we say vulnerable, it's, is it inundated? And this isn't just for roadways, but it's kind of that wet versus flood proofing. And I'm with Mike that I think heat is a really big component of this that I don't think is talked about quite enough. But wet versus dry proofing, right? Is it just that the roads are never inundated or they are and they're back to service within a certain amount of time? Like what is the actual outcome that we're looking for? Because if it is just a reduction in disruption of service, then the miles of roadway actually isn't a good metric for the improvements that we're making. And it's like that connection point.
Be interesting too to think about, I mean, from our perspective, I don't know how much this resonates with everyone else, but we were talking about place-based resilience. It would be interesting to think about if for different regions, even there are honestly different metrics of importance, and that would be a way to start dividing it up. And if there would be, because I think it becomes really hard to talk about it at the state level sometimes because we know we're kind of measuring apples to bees to snakes. So it's just not, it just doesn't quite click. So that could be something to think about too if we want to start thinking about regional metrics or more place-based metrics that we can take a look at. But I do think I think right now it would be great if we had that number of how much are we even spending on resilience. I think that is a good, not an easy thing to do, but at least philosophically, there should be a way to get started there. Then it would be great to even be able to track things miles of shoreline to get those effort metrics. And then I think outcomes is the really, really hard piece that is going to take us longer to do. And I think we'd all be scared to have that in legislation anytime soon. But to me, it feels like all of those things are really worthy goals. And we probably will just have to be pretty creative and iterative on the outcome side.
Allison, I actually, when you were first reading the metric, was seeing that it's actually a really kind of clever way to state it because it could increase or it could decrease, it could improve or it could not improve, I guess. And it's interesting because I feel like you can have, road miles that are vulnerable to X amount of flooding, or if you wanted to measure more of those specifics, where you still are saying, yes, we have roads that are vulnerable to flooding, but they have those different thresholds, or it's not necessarily communities protected from flooding, but how many communities are vulnerable to X amount of flooding. But I don't know, that's making me think of all the mapping efforts though, and SHA literally has that map.
Yeah.
But I guess if you were doing more adaptation strategies or moving or elevating roads, for example, you would see those decrease over time, but would still, I don't know, I kind of like it because it doesn't constrain you to okay, well, if we didn't have funding this year, we didn't show any progress. It's just kind of, it's still something that you're measuring, but not necessarily it doesn't have to be positive or negative.
Yeah, I forget what the term is. It's not a leading indicator, but there's a term for a decrease, whatever. That's the type of indicator that it is. And it is not, my perspective on that wasn't specifically around that wasn't an indicator that should have chosen. It's the fact that we even now have a resilience metric in our team report as part of the general goal and the vision for MDOT is great. Just an example of how an agency is tackling this, which is we have these resilient goals. It's in our overall plan. We have to track it. How are we doing that? And then knowing, I think it's really that communication piece, which is there's going to be limitations and pros and cons to every metric or data source or anything that you have. And how do you effectively communicate it so that people know what they're reading or seeing, and then applying it correctly. And I think that's maybe a piece that's on top of having to figure all of it out, we then also have to figure out how to communicate about it. Again, if anyone knows how to do that, put my email on the chat.
I feel like it's almost what makes, sorry, next gen so effective though, like you could measure the percentage of like how next gen is moving, which indicates, indicates like.
All right, well, thanks everybody for that, great, robust discussion. I'd like to, in the last 5 minutes, open it up to any public comments. 2 minutes please for anyone attending who would like to raise their hand or put their name in the chat to speak. Well, thanks everybody for your time. Our next meeting is on May 28th. And as we said, you'll look for information from Ryland coming on tracking spreadsheets and other things to have ready for that May meeting. We'll adjourn.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.